I never expected to inherit anything from a grandfather I had barely known. The lawyer's call came on a Tuesday morning while I was rushing to catch the subway to work. Apparently, my grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep at 93, leaving me his entire estate in rural Pennsylvania. "There's just one condition," the lawyer mentioned, almost casually. "He left specific instructions about a certain key. Said you'd understand when you found it." I didn't understand anything. I'd only met the old man twice in my life. Once at a family reunion when I was 8, and again at my father's funeral 5 years ago. Both times he'd seemed distant, preoccupied, like he was carrying some invisible burden. The farmhouse was older than I'd expected, built sometime in the 1800s, with thick stone walls and windows that seemed too small for the rooms they served. It felt like stepping back in time. Everything was neat and orderly, as if my grandfather had been preparing for his departure. I found the key on his desk, along with a letter addressed to me in his shaky handwriting. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with one line: "Only open the cellar door when the moon is dark." The key was heavier than it looked, solid iron, ornate, with symbols I didn't recognize carved into its surface. It came with a single instruction scrawled in my grandfather's shaky handwriting: "Only open the cellar door when the moon is dark." I'd inherited his farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania after he passed last month. 93 years old, died in his sleep, leaving me property I'd never even visited. The house was older than I expected, built in the 1800s with thick stone walls and windows that seemed too small for the rooms they served. The cellar door stood at the end of the kitchen hallway, heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, secured by 3 different locks. But it was the smell that made me hesitate. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a grave. My first week there, I heard scratching sounds coming from below, soft at first, then more insistent, like fingernails on wood, or maybe claws. The sounds always stopped when I got close to the door. The neighbors were no help. Old Mrs. Weber, who lived a mile down the road, just crossed herself when I mentioned the cellar. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, "but some knowledge is better left buried." But curiosity killed more than just cats. I waited for the new moon. 3 nights ago, when the sky was black as pitch and the stars seemed dimmer than usual. The key turned easily in the first lock, then the second. But the third lock, it opened by itself. Just clicked open the moment I touched it, like it had been waiting. The stairs descended into darkness that my flashlight could barely penetrate. 27 steps. I counted each one. The cellar was larger than the house above, stretching beyond the reach of my light. The walls were carved directly from the earth, reinforced with stones that looked much older than the house itself. In the center of the room stood a table. On it, 13 glass jars filled with a dark liquid. Each jar contained something floating inside, shapes I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Next to the jars lay a leather-bound journal. The journal's first entry was dated 1847, written in my great-great-grandfather's hand. "The covenant continues. The village remains protected. The harvest grows stronger each year." I flipped through pages of cramped writing, diagrams of symbols and lists of names. Some names were crossed out in red ink, others were circled. At the bottom of each page, the same phrase appeared: "The hungry earth must be fed." The last entry was from 3 weeks ago, in my grandfather's handwriting. "I am too old to continue. The responsibility passes to the next generation. Omar must choose, honor the covenant or face the consequences." The 13 families have kept the secret for over a century. What sleeps beneath the fields must not wake. That's when I noticed the jars more carefully. The liquid wasn't liquid at all. It was moving, swirling like it was alive. And the shapes inside? They looked almost like tiny hands, reaching, grasping. I grabbed the journal and ran, slamming the cellar door behind me, but I could hear something following me up the stairs, something that stopped just short of the door. The scratching sounds haven't stopped since. They're getting louder, more urgent. And yesterday, I found a letter slipped under my door. No postmark, no signature, just 5 words written in red ink. The covenant must be honored. I've read the entire journal now. I know what my family has been doing for generations. I know why the town's crops always thrive while neighboring areas struggle. I know what's buried in the 13 locations marked on the map I found tucked between the journal's pages. But I also know what happens to the families who try to break the covenant. The moon will be dark again in 3 days.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you dare to hear more chilling stories. The old darkroom in the basement of Jefferson High had been abandoned for decades, but Sarah found the key exactly where the janitor said it would be, taped under the water fountain outside the principal's office. She'd been trying to get access for weeks for her photography project, and finally convinced him to let her use it after school. "Just don't blame me if you see things in those pictures that weren't there when you took them," he'd said with a nervous laugh. "That room's got history." The dark room was larger than she expected, with professional equipment that looked expensive despite its age. Red lights cast everything in an eerie glow, and the chemical smell was strong, but not unpleasant. On the walls hung dozens of black and white photographs, school events, sports games, portraits of students from what looked like the 1960s and 70s. What struck her as odd was that in every photo, one student appeared in the background. Same kid, different events, sometimes decades apart. He never seemed to age. Sarah had come to develop the roll of film she'd shot around town for her senior project, black and white street photography mostly. Old buildings, interesting shadows, people going about their daily lives. She'd been particularly excited about the shots she'd taken in the old cemetery on Maple Street. The first few photos developed normally. The hardware store, the diner, Mrs. Peterson walking her dog. But when the cemetery photos began to appear in the developer solution, Sarah felt her stomach drop. In every single cemetery photo, there were more people than she remembered being there. A lot more. She'd taken the photos on a Tuesday afternoon when the cemetery was empty except for the groundskeeper, who'd been working on the far side of the property. But in the developed images, dozens of people stood among the headstones. They were pale, translucent, but definitely there, and they were all looking directly at the camera. Sarah checked her negatives. The figures were there too, which meant they'd been captured when she took the photos, not added during development. But that was impossible. The next photo made her gasp out loud. It was a shot she'd taken of the old church next to the cemetery. In the foreground stood a young man about her age, wearing clothes from what looked like the 1960s and 70s. He was staring directly at the camera with an expression of desperate urgency, his mouth open as if he were shouting something. It was the same kid from all the photos on the darkroom walls. She grabbed one of the wall photos for comparison. Same face, same clothes, same desperate expression. But this wall photo was dated 1967, and the kid looked identical to the figure in her modern digital camera's image. The photo still in the developer was changing. The boy in the image was moving, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear but could somehow understand. "Get out. Before midnight. They're coming back." She looked at her phone. 11:47 p.m. The darkroom door, which she was certain she'd left unlocked, wouldn't budge. The red lights began to flicker, and she could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, multiple sets of feet walking in perfect synchronization. She looked at the photos on the walls again. In every single one, the background figures were gone. The photos showed only empty spaces where dozens of people had been standing moments before. The footsteps stopped right outside the darkroom door. 3 soft knocks, then silence. Sarah held her breath and checked her phone. 11:58 p.m. The knocking came again, but this time from inside the darkroom, from the walls, from beneath the floor, from the ceiling above her head. In the developer tray, her cemetery photos were still changing. The transparent figures were now moving, walking toward the camera, their faces becoming clearer with each passing second. She could see their mouths moving in unison, all saying the same thing: "Welcome to the club." 11:59 p.m., the darkroom lights went out completely, plunging her into absolute darkness. But somehow, the photos continued to glow with their own pale light, showing dozens of ghostly figures now reaching out of the images toward her. Sarah fumbled for her phone's flashlight, but when the beam cut through the darkness, she saw that she was no longer alone in the darkroom. The boy from the 1960s stood in the corner, no longer desperate but smiling sadly. Behind him, dozens of other figures materialized, students from different decades, all wearing the clothes of their respective eras, all bearing the same expression of resigned acceptance. Midnight Photography Club meets every night, and they're always looking for new members. Sarah's phone showed 12:00 a.m. exactly. The last thing she remembered was the flash of an old camera bulb, impossibly bright in the darkness, capturing her image for the wall. The next morning, the janitor found the darkroom empty, except for wet photographs scattered on the floor and one new image pinned to the wall. A girl with modern clothes standing among the cemetery headstones, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with the sudden understanding of what she joined. The photography club always meets at midnight, and they're always looking for new members.
Don't forget to like and subscribe if you dare to hear more chilling stories. The recipe book arrived 3 days after my grandmother's funeral, delivered by a lawyer I'd never met. Thick leather binding, pages yellowed with age, filled with her spidery handwriting. The note attached was brief. "For Emma, my most promising student, use these wisely." I'd always loved cooking with Grandma Rose, but this book contained recipes I'd never seen her make. Strange dishes with ingredients I couldn't pronounce, accompanied by detailed instructions that read more like rituals than cooking methods. Brewed during the new moon. Add tears willingly given. Speak the words of binding while stirring counterclockwise. The first recipe that caught my attention was titled Happiness Bread. The ingredients seemed normal enough: flour, yeast, honey, but the instructions were bizarre. Bake while thinking of your deepest desire. Share with someone you wish to influence. Results appear within 7 days. My roommate Jessica had been depressed for months after her breakup. She barely ate, barely slept, spent most days in bed watching Netflix. I figured a little magical thinking couldn't hurt, and maybe some homemade bread would cheer her up. I followed the recipe exactly, thinking about Jessica's happiness while I kneaded the dough. The bread turned out perfectly. Golden crust, soft interior with a smell that filled our apartment with warmth. Jessica devoured half the loaf that evening, the first real meal she'd eaten in weeks. "This is incredible," she said. "I feel lighter somehow." Within 3 days, she was back to her old self, laughing, going out with friends, even dating again. I was thrilled that the bread had helped, even if it was just a placebo effect. But then I found the second note in the recipe book, tucked between the pages like a bookmark. In my grandmother's handwriting, "Every gift has a price. Every recipe requires balance. What is given to one must be taken from another. I didn't understand what it meant until I started feeling it. A heaviness in my chest, a gray fog that clouded my thoughts. While Jessica blossomed, I began to wither. The depression she'd lost had somehow transferred to me. I flipped through more pages, finding recipes with increasingly ominous names: binding soup, truth serum tea, revenge cake. Each came with the same warning about balance, about prices that had to be paid. The phone rang while I was reading. Jessica, calling from a date, gushing about how wonderful life had become. I forced myself to sound happy for her while my own world grew darker by the hour. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood in her old kitchen, stirring a pot that bubbled with dark liquid. "The recipes aren't just food, dear," she said without looking at me. "They're tools. But tools can cut the user if handled carelessly." "How do I fix this?" I asked. "How do I stop what I started?" She finally looked at me, her eyes sad but unsurprised. "Read the last page, Emma, the one I hoped you'd never need." I woke and grabbed the book, flipping to the final recipe. The title made my blood run cold: The Cook's Final Feast. The ingredients list was simple: everything I had used in previous recipes, combined with one addition: the willing sacrifice of the cook's own essence. The instructions were even chilling. To break all previous workings, the cook must serve herself as the final ingredient. A sound from the kitchen made me look up. The stove was on, though I hadn't touched it. A pot of water was beginning to boil. On the counter sat ingredients I didn't remember buying. Herbs with names I couldn't pronounce, vials of liquids that seemed to glow in the dim light. Jessica appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong with her face. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too bright. "Making something special tonight?" she asked, but her voice sounded like my grandmother's. I looked down at the recipe book. The words were changing, rearranging themselves into new instructions. Feed the hungry, satisfy the debt, join the sisterhood of cooks who came before. On the kitchen table, I found a stack of recipe books identical to mine. Each bore a different woman's name on the cover: my grandmother's, my great-grandmother's, names going back generations. All the women in my family who'd been natural cooks, who could make any dish perfect, who somehow always knew exactly what people needed to eat. The last book in the stack was blank, except for my name, embossed in fresh gold lettering. The pot was boiling now, sending steam that carried whispers and voices I almost recognized. Jessica stood beside the stove, no longer pretending to be herself. Her face shifted between features I knew and ones I didn't. All the women who'd held this book before me. The recipes choose their cooks, and the cooks serve until they become ingredients themselves. It's time for your final lesson, Emma. I understood now why my grandmother had never married, why she lived alone, why she'd always seemed so sad when she cooked. She'd spent decades feeding people's desires while slowly feeding herself to something much hungrier. The recipe book was warm in my hands, its pages turning themselves to recipes I'd never seen before. New dishes appear as I watched: Emma's essence stew, the Last Supper soufflé, transition casserole. In the margin, new words appeared in my grandmother's handwriting. "I'm sorry, dear, but someone has to cook. Someone always has to cook." The kitchen filled with the smell of herbs and spices, and I felt my feet moving toward the stove against my will. The hungry book had found its next cook, and the feast was about to begin.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out, so subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.